Many systems in our society feel broken. The George Floyd murder revealed systemic racism in police departments. The sex abuse scandals exposed deep flaws in the Catholic Church. The election and other crises revealed how fragile our national political system is. Now, in the COVID vaccine rollout, we're already seeing delays, snafus, poor planning, and other flaws in this system. These flaws even risk causing some people to doubt getting vaccinated for themselves. How then do we respond as Christians when systems are broken? My name is Curtis Chang, and welcome to Redeeming Babel, where our mission is to provide biblical thinking in a confusing world. In this video, I want to describe a distinctively Jesus-shaped response to broken systems, one that will be different from what the world offers. Let's start with what it means when we say a system is broken. Really, what we're saying is that the institutions that make up a system are flawed. The biblical language for this flawed condition is sin. As Christians, we actually are equipped by the Bible to expect that sin affects all human institutions, because human institutions are, well, human. And the Bible teaches us that sin affects all humanity. So it's not just that all individuals are sinful, all institutions are as well. Now, I believe the world generally offers three responses to institutional sin. These standard responses are isolate, ignore, and insist. All three can be found on both the political left and the political right, and all three are ultimately unsatisfying. Let's start with the first option, isolate. The isolate response is to focus on removing any contact with institutional sin. No association is allowed. This is why flaws in the vaccine system can cause some people to avoid getting the vaccine. People want to avoid flawed systems in general. And in particular, Black Americans and pro-life Christians may isolate themselves from the vaccination program out of fear that such government programs are tainted with a past connection to racism or abortion. The isolate response is tempting on most any issue and across the political spectrum. On the left, a prime example of the isolate response is the cancel culture. That's especially powerful in higher education. In the cancel culture, there is this drive to expel anyone that has even a taint of racism, sexism, or some other ism. Anyone suspected faces the threat of being cut off from acceptability. On the political right, the isolate response gets focused on issues like abortion. In this vein, it can be viewed as unacceptable to vote for anyone that's pro-choice. There can be no political association whatsoever. But the problem with the isolate response is that it's impossible for anyone to maintain purity. Take abortion, for instance. If you are a pro-life Christian like me, you should be bothered by how the Chinese regime promotes institutional abortion, even enforcing it on vulnerable religious minorities. However, if I trace my own consumer purchases, I have to admit that I'm actually supporting the Chinese regime. Right now, I'm wearing multiple clothing items made in China. If you're watching this video, you're probably using electronic components made in China. All of those purchases ultimately sent some money into the coffers of the Chinese regime. It would be incredibly difficult, practically impossible, for any of us to stop being connected in some way to this system that practices abortion. The point is that we cannot isolate ourselves from institutional sin. We're always touching and even relying on some institution that has a history of sin. So what then about the second option? If we can't isolate ourselves from institutional sin, should we then just ignore it? The ignore response is where one's willing to participate in a sinful system, so willing, in fact, that one's fine with ignoring its flaws. With the COVID vaccine, the ignore response would be to just care about getting vaccinated yourself, but ignore institutional dynamics that might mean certain racial groups are missing out, or whether the wealthy are getting unfair preferential access. The temptation to just ignore certain sins is such a strong human temptation. It is, in fact, why we're so divided in our country between left and right. This is because no one can consistently ignore all institutional sin. Some sins affect us more directly and more personally. We don't ignore those, but we end up just ignoring the ones that affect other people. This is why, to generalize a bit, Christians on the left will tend to focus on racism but ignore abortion, and Christians on the right will focus on abortion but ignore racism. Each then ends up thinking that the other is blind and uncaring. But for a Christian, ignoring sin is just not a legitimate option. To ignore sin is to say it doesn't matter, which means we're saying to the people affected, you don't matter. And this response is about as far away from Jesus as you can get. And it is dividing our country and our church. The third type of response to sin is insist. By insist, I'm referring to the response that insists someone must fix this. But the key here is that someone is someone else. Take, for example, the problem of economic inequality. The classic argument of the left is that it should be the government that fixes this problem. The classic argument on the right is that it should be the poor people themselves that fix it. I don't presume to have an easy answer myself. My point here is that when people make loud proclamations about something wrong with a system, they rarely place the responsibility on themselves for the problem or the solution. The insist mode is all about finger pointing and finger wagging. It's those people that are the problem. It's those institutions that should do something about it. Finger pointing and finger wagging can feel emotionally satisfying at first, but the biblical understanding of original sin is that sin ensnares everyone, even the people pointing and wagging. For example, during the pandemic, there was this dynamic where some government leaders insisted on social distancing and other people not seeing family during the holidays. And then we discovered those leaders, well, at least some of them, had done just that. And we recoiled at their hypocrisy. See, sin ensnares us all, even the insisters. All three responses, isolate, ignore, or insist, are tempting, but ultimately unsatisfactory. This is why I believe we humans need God. And this is why I so love the God revealed in Jesus. In Jesus, God chose a radically different response, the response of incarnation. God could have chosen to isolate himself from fallen humanity, but in Jesus, God became human. One can't get any closer than that. And when God became human, he did not ignore institutional sin. He confronted the broken temple system and the oppressive Roman regime. And because Jesus refused to ignore their sin, they crucified him for it. Finally, on the cross, Jesus responded to sin by taking responsibility for it himself. He did not wag his fingers at humanity and say, "You all must fix things." Instead, he stretched out his arms and said, "I will fix all things. I will fix things by bearing the sin, suffering the sin, and eventually reworking sin into healing for the world." The incarnation was God's response to all sin, including institutional sin, and it sets the pattern for how Jesus' followers can respond to broken systems today. So now, as we face the flaws in the vaccination rollout, what would incarnation look like? Well, perhaps you're someone who tends towards the isolate option. Maybe you're a bit unsure about the vaccine because you fear it's tainted with some sin, whether that sin is abortion, racism, or government intrusion, or something else. Would you be open to the reality that everything is tainted with some institutional sin, that it's impossible to isolate ourselves? So like Jesus, would you be willing to embrace a flawed human system and do so for the sake of your own healing and the healing of the world? Or perhaps you're someone who tends towards the ignore option. Maybe you plan to take the vaccine, but you can't believe that you have friends and family who are suspicious. And maybe you're tempted to just go into ignore mode with them. Would you be open to re-engaging them to think more critically about the vaccine? If it helps, you can send them some of these videos to open the conversation. Finally, can we all resist the temptation to go into insisting mode when we encounter flaws in the system? The vaccination rollout is incredibly complex. It's going to be flawed. Rather than going into insisting mode, can we as Christians go into incarnation mode? Instead of the spirit of finger pointing and wagging, can we be like Jesus and stretch out our arms? Maybe it's stretching out our arms willingly and patiently, waiting for when our assigned turn comes. Maybe it's stretching out our arms to help our own companies, schools, and nonprofit agencies figure out how to play their role in the overall process. Maybe it's just stretching out our arms to pat on the back tired and overworked healthcare workers who are doing their best and saying to them, thank you. A broken system is actually a moment of great opportunity for Christians to reflect Jesus to the world. Let's resist the temptation to isolate, ignore, or insist. Let's follow Jesus, the incarnation of God. The pandemic has spread person to person. Ending the pandemic will also spread person to person, as each of us shares the necessary truth about the vaccine to those who are unsure. If you know someone who would benefit from this video, please take the time to share it with them.